Before we start today's video, I would like to mention that this is not the same type of video as what is usually uploaded to this channel, as it is a documentary-style detailed episode that discusses in detail the events and alliances of the Second World War. Additionally, if you enjoy this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this film and other videos with individuals who might also enjoy them. By the late 1930s, tensions in Europe had been rising due to a combination of factors. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, placed heavy reparations and territorial losses on Germany. This treaty caused economic hardship and national humiliation, fueling a desire for revenge and the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. His aggressive foreign policy, which aimed at expanding German territory and undoing the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, began to surface in the mid-1930s. Hitler's ideology of racial superiority and expansionism set the stage for conflict. Led by Benito Mussolini, Italy became increasingly aggressive in the 1930s. Mussolini had already invaded Ethiopia in 1935, signaling his imperial ambitions. Japan had been expanding its influence in East Asia, notably through its invasion of China in 1937, under the belief that it needed more resources to fuel its growing industrial economy. The British and French governments initially followed a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid another conflict by conceding to some of Hitler's demands. This was evident in the Munich Agreement of 1938, which allowed Germany to annex Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland region, in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. A surprising diplomatic development occurred when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This non-aggression pact ensured that Germany would not face a two-front war by preventing the Soviet Union from attacking Germany while it focused on conquering Western Europe. The pact included a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with Poland being divided between the two countries. Hitler's invasion of Poland was the immediate cause of the outbreak of World War II. Germany's military, using blitzkrieg tactics, quickly overwhelmed Polish defenses. Germany claimed the invasion was in response to Polish aggression and to protect ethnic Germans in Poland, but the real motive was territorial expansion. The invasion of Poland led to Britain and France, who had guaranteed Poland's borders, declaring war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Both Britain and France had declared that if Germany invaded Poland, they would go to war. After the invasion, they followed through on these promises, formally declaring war on Germany on September 3, 1939. However, despite the declarations, there was little military action from the Western Allies in the first months of the war, which would later be called the Phony War. Poland, caught between the overwhelming forces of Germany and the Soviet Union, fell quickly. By the end of September 1939, the Polish government had fled, and the country was divided and occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. This marked the end of the first major campaign of World War II, but it was just the beginning of a much larger global conflict. While the European theater of war was unfolding, Japan had already been engaged in the Second Sino-Japanese War since 1937. The war between Japan and China was brutal, with horrific atrocities committed, such as the Nanjing Massacre in 1937. Japan's aggressive expansion in the Pacific and Asia would later tie into the larger global conflict. After the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union remained neutral in the early stages of the war. However, it invaded eastern Poland on September 17, 1939 from the east, following the secret protocol of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. After the declarations of war by Britain and France, There was a period of limited military activity in Western Europe known as the Phoney War. Though there was little fighting on the Western Front in 1939, both sides began to prepare for the larger battles to come. As Germany sought to dominate Europe, the Allies, particularly Britain, faced the challenge of maintaining supply lines across the Atlantic Ocean. German U-boats began to target British merchant ships, leading to a prolonged naval conflict. Although aerial combat was not a major part of the conflict in 1939, it was becoming increasingly important as both sides started developing air forces capable of engaging in strategic bombing and support for ground troops. In 1940, the German military's blitzkrieg tactics continued to dominate the battlefield. After the invasion of Poland in 1939, which led to the start of World War II, the next major phase of German expansion occurred in 1940. Operation Weserübung was Germany's military campaign aimed at securing strategic territories in Northern Europe, particularly Denmark and Norway. Hitler sought control of Norway to prevent the Allies from gaining access to the Scandinavian country, which would give them control over vital sea routes and resources like the Swedish iron ore. Denmark fell almost immediately, but the fight for Norway was more prolonged. The British and French launched efforts to resist the German occupation, but ultimately, by June 1940, Germany had control over Norway, with British forces retreating. Germany's invasion of France in May 1940, part of Operation Fall Gelb, was the culmination of months of preparation. The Germans bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by invading through the Ardennes forest, a region considered impassable for large armies. This led to the German encirclement of French, British, and Belgian forces with the Dunkirk evacuation from May 26 to June 4, 1940, being a dramatic escape for more than 330,000 Allied soldiers. Paris fell to the Germans on June 14, 1940, and soon after, the Vichy government was established, which collaborated with Nazi Germany. France was divided into the German-occupied north and the Vichy-controlled south. After the fall of France, Hitler's attention turned to Britain. Germany's Luftwaffe Air Force launched the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. The Germans aimed to gain air superiority over Britain, paving the way for a potential invasion known as Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe targeted British airfields, radar stations, and cities, hoping to break British morale. However, the Royal Air Force, particularly the use of radar and the efforts of fighter pilots, including the famous Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft, thwarted the German plans. By the autumn of 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its goal, and the German invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. The Battle of Britain was a critical victory for the Allies and one of the few setbacks for Nazi Germany. As the war continued, control of the seas became vital. The Battle of the Atlantic was a prolonged naval conflict in which the Allied convoys, particularly British and American, sought to transport vital supplies and troops across the Atlantic to Britain, while the German U-boats attempted to cut off this supply line. The German U-boat fleet intensified its attacks on merchant ships and military vessels, while Britain sought to maintain its naval blockade and convoy system. Early in the war, German U-boats were very successful, sinking significant amounts of Allied shipping, but advancements in radar, depth charges, and convoy tactics gradually began to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. While Germany was making significant military gains, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were expanding their influence in different parts of the world. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, entered the war on the side of the Axis powers in June 1940, hoping to expand its territorial holdings. However, Italy's military was not as strong or prepared as Germany's. In North Africa, Italian forces launched an invasion of Egypt from their colony in Libya, but were soon repelled by British forces. Mussolini's involvement in the war had mixed results, and his military campaigns were often unsuccessful or bogged down by lack of preparation. While the events in Europe were dominating the headlines, Japan's imperial ambitions were also advancing. Japan had already been engaged in the Second Sino-Japanese War since 1937, and by 1940, it was seeking to expand its influence in Southeast Asia. Japan's military victories would eventually lead to the Japanese attack on the United States Pacific territories, including Pearl Harbor in 1941. But in 1940, Japan had already aligned itself with Germany and Italy in the Axis powers. At this point, the United States had not yet entered the war, but was already becoming involved in supporting the Allies. In March 1940, the United States began providing significant aid to Britain and later to the other Allied nations through the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the U.S. to send military supplies and equipment to countries fighting against the Axis powers without requiring immediate payment. The U.S. was providing supplies, airplanes, and other vital materials to the United Kingdom, helping to support the British war effort as they continued to stand alone against Nazi Germany. The year 1940 also saw significant political changes that affected the course of the war. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in May 1940, succeeding Neville Chamberlain. Churchill's leadership was crucial in rallying British resistance against Nazi Germany and leading the country through the darkest days of the war. On the other side, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany appeared unstoppable as they pushed further into Europe, though the failure of the Battle of Britain showed that they could be resisted. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was not yet directly involved in combat with Germany in 1940, though it had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany in 1939, agreeing to a non-aggression pact and secretly dividing Eastern Europe between the two powers. In 1941, the Axis powers, primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan, continued their aggressive military campaigns across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, aimed at conquering the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian forces, crossed the Soviet border. The initial phase of the invasion was highly successful, with the German army advancing deep into Soviet territory. However, the harsh Russian winter, vast distances, and stiff Soviet resistance eventually stalled the German offensive. Key battles during this period, including the Siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Moscow, and the Battle of Kiev. In 1941, the Axis powers, led by Germany's Erwin Rommel, were engaged in a brutal struggle for control in North Africa. In early 1941, Rommel's Afrika Korps launched a series of attacks in Libya and Egypt. By the end of the year, the British Eighth Army had managed to push back the Axis forces and relieve the siege of Tobruk. The conflict in North Africa would continue for several more years, but 1941 was crucial in shifting the momentum. The expansion of the Pacific War. Japan, already engaged in war with China, decided to expand its imperial ambitions further into the Pacific. On December 7th, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack caused significant damage to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging numerous battleships and aircraft. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The attack led to the United States declaring war on Japan the following day, marking its formal entry into World War II. On December 11, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing America into the European theater as well. The battle for control of the Atlantic Ocean was crucial for both the Allies and the Axis. Germany's U-boats waged an effective campaign to cut off Britain from vital supplies, particularly food and raw materials. The Allied convoy system, along with the use of new technology like radar and sonar, helped to slow the German U-boat threat. In 1941, the U.S. began providing more direct support to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the U.S. to send war supplies and materials to Britain and later the Soviet Union, even though the U.S. was not yet officially in the war. In 1941, the Nazi regime began the systematic extermination of Jews, Romani people, and other undesirable across occupied Europe. Early in the year, the Nazis started mass executions of Jews in Eastern Europe and set up extermination camps. Special Nazi death squads, called Eisengruppen, followed the advancing German army into the Soviet Union, rounding up and executing tens of thousands of Jews and Soviet civilians. The ghettoization of Jews began in earnest in places like Warsaw, and the mass transportation of Jews in concentration camps started. This would lay the foundation for the full-scale genocide and would unfold in 1942 and beyond. While initially neutral, the U.S. increasingly supported the Allied powers, particularly Britain and the Soviet Union, through Lend-Lease programs and other forms of military aid. In August 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met secretly on a ship off Newfoundland and issued the Atlantic Charter, a joint declaration of war aims and a vision for the post-war world. U.S. naval ships engaged in combat with German U-boats in the Atlantic prior to official entry into the war, providing indirect support to Britain and its convoys. Early in 1941, Germany and Italy launched a campaign in the Balkans, securing the region for the Axis powers. German forces successfully invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, defeating both the British and local forces. German forces quickly overran Greece, and the British were forced to withdraw, with many troops retreating to Crete. This also marked the beginning of a more active resistance movement in countries like Greece, Yugoslavia, and the rest of occupied Europe, where both communists and monarchists fought against the Axis forces. Operation Typhoon, launched by the Germans in October 1941, was a major offensive aimed at capturing the Soviet capital, Moscow. Initially, the Germans made rapid progress, but were slowed by the Soviet defense and the onset of the brutal Russian winter. By December 1941, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from Moscow and saving the city. The failure of Operation Barbarossa to achieve its objectives was a significant turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were strengthening their ties throughout 1941. Their Tripartite Pact was signed earlier in 1940, formalizing the military alliance between the three nations. The Allies, on the other hand, were solidifying their relationships. The United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and China were at war with the Allies, and the United States would soon join them. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7, 1941, it set the stage for much of the fighting in the Pacific in 1942. The surprise attack by Japan on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor led to the United States' entry into World War II. The Battle of Coral Sea in May of 1942 was the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft carriers, with American and Australian forces successfully halted the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. It marked the first time in history that a Japanese invasion force was turned back. The Battle of Midway in early June was one of the most decisive in the Pacific theater. The United States, having broken Japan's naval code, ambushed and destroyed 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers, effectively crippling the Japanese fleet. Midway is considered a turning point in the Pacific War, as Japan's offensive capabilities were significantly diminished. In the Guadalcanal campaign, the U.S. launched a campaign to take the Solomon Islands and establish a base from which to attack Japan. The Battle of Guadalcanal was one of the first major Allied offensives against Japan. The struggle for control of the island lasted for months, with heavy casualties on both sides. The battle for Stalingrad in southern Russia was one of the largest and bloodiest confrontations of the war. In 1942, German forces, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, advanced toward the city of Stalingrad, aiming to secure oil fields in the Caucasus. The Soviet Red Army, led by General Vasily Chuikov, mounted a determined defense, which culminated in the encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army by the Soviets. This marked the beginning of the German retreat from the Soviet Union and was a critical turning point in the Eastern Front. In North Africa, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery decisively defeated the German-Italian Afrika Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel. The victory at El Alamein halted the Axis advance into Egypt and protected the Suez Canal, a critical supply route to the German Middle East and oil-rich regions. It was a major setback for the Axis in North Africa. The United States, in coordination with British forces, launched Operation Torch, an invasion of French North Africa. This operation aimed to secure control of the region, cut off Axis supply lines, and open a new front against Germany and Italy. The successful landings in Morocco and Algeria forced Axis forces to retreat westward. In 1942, the Allies intensified their strategic bombing campaigns against Nazi Germany. British bombers carried out nightly raids on German cities, while the United States, following the entry into the war, began bombing campaigns over occupied Europe. The U.S. Army Air Forces, under General Hap Arnold, also began long-range bombing missions using B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. These bombing raids aimed to cripple German industry and morale, although they caused significant civilian casualties. The German Navy continued its campaign to disrupt Allied shipping in the Atlantic Ocean. U-boats targeted Allied merchant ships and military convoys with the goal of starving Britain and preventing reinforcements from reaching Europe. In 1942, both sides suffered heavy losses, but the Allies began to develop better countermeasures, such as sonar, convoy systems, and more effective anti-submarine warfare tactics. While the systematic extermination of Jews and other minorities began in 1941 with the opening of death camps like Auschwitz, 1942 saw the acceleration of the Holocaust. The Nazis began mass killings of Jews in extermination camps as part of the final solution. This year saw the implementation of industrial-scale genocide, with millions of Jews being murdered in death camps, such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. The year 1942 on the Eastern Front was marked by the German offensive to capture key industrial and oil-rich regions in the Soviet Union. While the Germans achieved some early successes, the harsh winter, stretched supply lines, and determined Soviet resistance began to take their toll. The siege of Leningrad in September 1941 to January 1944 continued, with German forces encircling the city. but the Soviet defense remained resilient. The US military expanded rapidly after its entry into the war. In 1942, the US began mass-producing war materials, and millions of American soldiers were trained and deployed to various theaters. The US also began organizing and training new alliances with the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and other nations. The US played a major role in providing economic aid through the Lend-Lease program, sending weapons, supplies, and resources to the Allies. 1942 is considered a turning point in World War II because the Axis powers began to suffer significant defeats, and the Allies began to gain momentum. After the battles of Midway, El Alamein, and Stalingrad, the Axis forces were in retreat on multiple fronts. The year also saw technological advances. The development of radar, code breaking, notably the breaking of the Japanese naval code by the United States, and improved aircraft and tanks began to play crucial roles. By the end of 1942, the Axis powers faced severe shortages in manpower, resources, and morale. Germany's defeat at Stalingrad, Italy's inability to secure North Africa, and Japan's losses in the Pacific signaled a shift in the balance of power. The Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest and most decisive battles of World War II, ended in early 1943 with a Soviet victory. After months of brutal fighting, the German Sixth Army, which had been encircled by the Soviet Red Army, surrendered on January 31st. This defeat marked a major turning point in the Eastern Front, as the Germans were forced into retreat, and the Soviet Union began a series of successful offensives. The defeat at Stalingrad dealt a severe blow to Nazi Germany's strategic position in the East, and shifted the balance of power in favor of the Allies on the Eastern Front. In 1943, the Allies launched the Italian campaign to knock Italy out of the war. The Allied forces began with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, known as Operation Husky. This was a major amphibious and airborne operation that eventually led to the fall of Mussolini's fascist government. On September 3, 1943, the Allies invaded the Italian mainland at Salerno, Operation Avalanche. By September 8th, Italy had surrendered to the Allies, but German forces quickly took control of northern Italy, leading to a prolonged campaign in which Italian partisans and the Allies fought against the German occupiers. After the disaster at Stalingrad, the Soviet Red Army began pushing westward, reclaiming territory and making significant gains. Key battles like the Kursk from July 5th to 12th, 1943, the largest tank battle in history, saw the Soviet forces decisively defeating the Germans. This marked the end of any major German offensive on the Eastern Front and began a prolonged Soviet advance towards Germany. The Battle of Guadalcanal, fought between Allied forces, primarily American, and the Japanese, concluded in February 1943. This marked the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. The Japanese suffered heavy losses and were forced to abandon the island, signaling the beginning of a strategic shift in the Pacific in favor of the Allies. After Guadalcanal, the United States began its island-hopping campaign, targeting key islands in the Pacific to move closer to Japan. In one of the most successful Allied air engagements in the Pacific, Allied forces destroyed a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. The battle significantly weakened Japanese naval forces and their ability to reinforce troops in New Guinea. Although fought in 1942, its repercussions extended into 1943. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first major naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, and it marked the first time that the Japanese were stopped in their expansion in the Pacific. Another decisive naval engagement that took place in 1942, but had lasting consequences in 1943. The Battle of Midway crippled Japan's naval strength and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific toward the Allies. The Japanese Navy was unable to recover fully from the loss of its aircraft carriers, which slowed their offensive capabilities in 1943. The Casablanca Conference was a key meeting between Franklin D. Roosevelt on behalf of the USA and Winston Churchill on behalf of the UK, in which they discussed military strategy and post-war planning. A key outcome was the declaration of the policy of unconditional surrender for the Axis powers, meaning that the Allies would not negotiate a peace settlement with Germany, Japan, or Italy, but instead would demand their complete surrender. The Tehran Conference marked the first meeting between the Big Three Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. The conference focused on military coordination, particularly the planning of the invasion of Normandy, D-Day, which was scheduled for 1944. A major decision was the commitment of the Soviets to launch a major offensive in Eastern Europe once the Western Allies opened a second front by invading Western Europe. In the United States, 1943 saw increased industrial production, with factories converting to wartime production. The country's economy boomed as factories began to churn out weapons, vehicles, and supplies for the war effort. There was also a large mobilization of manpower, with millions of Americans volunteering or being drafted into military service. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, particularly in factories, as part of the Rosie the Riveter movement. Across Axis-controlled Europe, there were growing civilian resistance movements, especially in countries like France, Poland, and Italy. The Allied bombings and disruptions in Axis supply lines helped weaken the Nazi war machine. In Italy, the partisans played a crucial role in resisting German occupation after the Italian surrender. Throughout 1943, the Allies intensified their bombing campaigns against Germany and its occupied territories. The British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces conducted numerous bombing raids on German industrial centers, infrastructure, and military targets. The raid on the Plotzi oil fields in Romania on August 1, 1943, was one of the significant operations aiming to cripple Nazi oil supplies. The year also saw advancements in radar, cryptography, and other technologies. For example, the Allies' ability to break German codes, such as the Enigma cipher, significantly contributed to their success in many military campaigns. 1943 marked a significant turning point for the Axis powers. The German military, particularly on the Eastern Front, was in retreat. The Italian surrender represented a major collapse of Axis strength in Southern Europe. The Japanese were also forced into a decisive and defensive position, particularly after the Battle of Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Coral Sea. One of the most significant events of 1944 was the D-Day invasion, officially known as Operation Overlord. The Allied forces, primarily made up of American, British, and Canadian troops, launched a large-scale amphibious assault on the beaches of Normandy, France. This operation aimed to establish a Western front against Nazi Germany, which had occupied much of Europe. The invasion was the result of months of meticulous planning and deception to confuse the German forces about the landing sites. On June 6th, over 156,000 troops were landed on 5 beachlands: Utah, Omaha, Gold Juno, and Sword. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. The success of D-Day marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. Within weeks, the Allies had broken out of Normandy, and by the end of the war, They had advanced deep into France, liberating Paris in August 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive in the West, launching in the Ardennes forest in Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The Germans sought to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and encircle the American forces. The Germans made significant progress, creating a bulge in the Allied lines. The surprise attack caught the Allies off guard, and they initially struggled to respond. Despite initial setbacks, the Allies, particularly American forces, managed to regroup and push back the Germans. Harsh winter conditions, combined with a lack of fuel and supplies, took a toll on both sides. The battle ended with heavy German losses, and the failure of the offensive further weakened Nazi Germany's position in the war. In 1944, the Soviet Union continued its counteroffensive against Germany on the Eastern Front, making substantial gains in Eastern Europe. Following the massive Soviet victory in the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the Red Army launched a series of successful offensives in 1944. One of the most notable of the operation was the Operation Bagration in June 1944, which destroyed much of the German Army Group center in Belarus, leading to a massive Soviet advance. By the end of 1944, the Soviets had liberated much of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, closing in on the borders of Germany. In the Pacific, the Allies, particularly the United States, made significant advances in 1944 as part of their island-hopping campaign. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October was one of the largest naval battles in history and marked the beginning of the Allied liberation of the Philippines. The United States decisively defeated the Japanese army, virtually eliminating its ability to defend its territories in the Pacific. American forces continued their advance through the Pacific, capturing key islands like Iwo Jima and Saipan, bringing them closer to Japan. During 1944, resistance movements in occupied countries became increasingly active, and the Allies provided support to undermine Axis control in Europe. The French resistance carried out sabotage missions and provided intelligence to the Allies. The success of D-Day was also a result of information from the resistance. Resistance groups in countries like Italy, Norway, and Yugoslavia carried out operations against German forces, making it harder for Nazi Germany to maintain control. On July 20, 1944, a group of German army officers, led by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler in what is known as the July 20th plot. The plan involved placing a bomb in a meeting room where Hitler was present, but the bomb failed to kill him. The failed assassination attempt led to a brutal crackdown. Hundreds of conspirators and suspected sympathizers were executed or sent to concentration camps. The plot highlighted the growing dissent within the German military and upper ranks of the Nazi regime. Throughout 1944, the Allied forces intensified their strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces carried out heavy bombing raids on German industrial centers, transportation hubs, and cities. The bombing campaign crippled Germany's ability to produce war materials and caused widespread destruction in cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg. The bombings resulted in significant civilian casualties, especially during the raid on Dresden in February 1945, which remains controversial due to the large number of civilian deaths. On August 25, 1944, after the successful D-Day landings and subsequent Allied advance through France, Paris was liberated. The Free French forces, led by General Charles de Gaulle, and the French resistance played a key role in the city's liberation. The liberation of Paris was a major morale boost for the Allies and marked the beginning of the end of Nazi occupation in Western Europe. The Holocaust continued to unfold throughout 1944, with millions of Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others being systematically murdered by the Nazis. By 1944, the Nazis were running numerous concentration and extermination camps across Europe, including Auschwitz, where over 1 million people were killed. The Allies began to receive more information about the atrocities being committed, though full awareness of the extent of the genocide became clearer only after the war. By the end of 1944, there were significant diplomatic discussions about the post-war world. In the Tehran Conference in November of 1943, the Allied leaders, including President Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, met to discuss the next steps in the war. They agreed on a coordinated approach to defeat the Axis powers, with the Soviets focusing on the Eastern Front and the Western Allies pushing through France. Talks about the post-war reconstruction began to take shape, including the planning for the establishment of the United Nations, which would be formed in 1945. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a critical moment in the Pacific Campaign. The United States launched an amphibious assault on the island of Iwo Jima, which was strategically important for the Japanese defense. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, with approximately 7,000 U.S. Marines and over 20,000 Japanese soldiers killed. The capture of Iwo Jima gave the U.S. a base for airstrikes against Japan's home islands. The Battle of Okinawa, lasting until June, was one of the largest and bloodiest amphibious attacks in the Pacific theater. The U.S. aimed to capture the island, which would serve as a base for air operations against Japan. The battle resulted in heavy casualties. Over 12,000 U.S. troops and around 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians lost their lives. As the U.S. forces advanced towards Japan, President Harold Truman authorized the development of the atomic bomb under the Manhattan Project. This was seen as a way to shorten the war and avoid an invasion of Japan, which would have caused many more casualties on both sides. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, made significant advances in Eastern Europe in early 1945. After the successful winter offensive of 1944 to 1945, the Red Army continued to push westward, liberating countries in Eastern Europe and advancing onto German territory. Soviet forces entered Poland and later crossed the Oder River, entering Germany itself. The Soviet Army liberated the notorious Nazi concentration and extermination camp of Auschwitz in Poland. This was a key moment in revealing the full scale of the Holocaust to the world. Thousands of survivors were freed from the camp, but the horrors of the genocide had already been carried out. The Yalta Conference, held in Crimea, was a major meeting between the big three leaders of the Allies: Franklin Roosevelt, United States; Winston Churchill, United Kingdom; and Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union. They discussed the post-war reorganization of Europe, the establishment of the United Nations, and how to deal with Germany and Japan after the war. One of the key decisions was to divide Germany into occupation zones among the Allies. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Nazi Germany, committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. His death signified the imminent collapse of the Third Reich. Eva Braun, his wife, also died by suicide alongside him. Nazi Germany officially surrendered to the Allies on May 7, 1945. This was the culmination of months of relentless Allied advances from both the East and West. The surrender marked the end of the war in Europe, and May 8, 1945 was declared Victory in Europe Day. celebrated by the Allied powers. The Soviet Union launched the final assault on Berlin in April 1945. The battle, which began on April 16th and ended on May 2nd, saw the Red Army encircle and capture the German capital. This was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, with immense civilian casualties and the complete destruction of the city. By 1945, Japan was severely weakened, with Allied forces conducting relentless bombing raids and naval blockades. Major cities like Tokyo were heavily bombed. However, Japan's military leadership was determined to continue fighting despite the growing odds against them. After Germany's surrender, the Allied leaders convened in Potsdam, Germany, to discuss the post-war settlement. U.S. President Harold Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin agreed on various issues, including the demilitarization and denazification of Germany and the future of Eastern Europe. The Potsdam Declaration, issued by the Allies, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan rejected this ultimatum. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, caused massive devastation, killing an estimated 140,000 people, either immediately or later due to radiation effects. 3 days later, on August 9th, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki, killing around 70,000 people. The destruction and the resulting shock led Japan to reconsider its position. Following the atomic bombings and the Soviet Union declaring war on Germany and Japan and invading Manchuria, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, in a radio broadcast. This day became known as Victory over Japan Day. Japan's formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, officially ending World War II. By the end of the war in 1945, approximately 70 to 85 million people had died, which was around 3% of the world's population at the time. The war left a legacy of unimaginable suffering, with millions of civilians, particularly in Europe and Asia, being displaced, murdered, or suffering from the aftermath of the conflict. In the wake of the war, efforts were made to prevent such a devastating conflict from happening again. The United Nations was created in 1945 to foster international cooperation and prevent future wars. The end of World War II also marked the beginning of the Cold War, as tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States began to rise. The Yalta Conference and other agreements had laid the groundwork for the division of Europe and the emerging ideological conflict between communist and capitalist blocs.